Across the rugged hills of Sardinia stand thousands of ancient stone towers. They have no inscriptions, no named kings, and no surviving records explaining why they were built. For generations, archaeologists called them fortresses, but the evidence found inside told a far stranger story. These towers were homes, storehouses, sacred spaces, and symbols of a civilization unlike any other in the Mediterranean. Before we uncover their true purpose, like the video and subscribe for more mysteries from the ancient world. At first light, the towers seem to grow out of Sardinia itself. Their stones are the same weathered grey and brown as the hills around them, and from a distance the ruins can be mistaken for broken ridges or ancient outcrops worn down by wind. Then the eye adjusts. A curved wall appears where no natural wall should be. A dark doorway opens beneath stacked blocks. Above it rises the stump of a tower that once stood much higher. Commanding a valley where sheep now move through dry grass and cork oaks cast shadows across the ground. Thousands of these structures are scattered across the island. Some stand alone on heights. Others sit beside villages, fields, springs, and roads used for centuries. They're called Nuraghi, and they belong to one of the distinctive societies of the Bronze Age Mediterranean. Yet the people who built them left no readable account of what they intended, no royal inscription naming a founder, and no surviving chronicle explaining why so much labour was poured into stone. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The silence surrounding the towers has made them unusually powerful objects. Their builders mastered metalworking, exchange, farming, herding, and masonry, but left no written history modern scholars can read. Archaeology must reconstruct their world from walls, pottery, animal bones, tools, hearths, wells, metal objects, and the changing arrangement of settlements. What survives in the record suggests a society far more complex than the old image of isolated warriors living in primitive stone forts. But the evidence remains incomplete, and every tower seems to preserve both an answer and another problem. The scale of the phenomenon is difficult to grasp until Sardinia is seen as a whole. Across an island of roughly 24,000 square kilometres, Nuraghi appear with astonishing frequency. The exact number is uncertain because some were destroyed, buried, reused, or reduced to low rings of stone. Estimates suggest more than 7,000 survive, while the original total was likely higher. In some districts, one tower can be seen from another. A traveller crossing the plains or uplands may pass several in a morning. One guards a ridge, another stands near fertile ground, another overlooks water, another hides in a fold of terrain. This variety matters because it complicates the idea that all were built for the same purpose. The most basic Nuraghi is a truncated circular tower with walls that slope inward as they rise. Inside, a narrow entrance leads through a thick passage into a central chamber roofed by a corbelled vault. Instead of using a true arch, builders placed each ring of stone slightly farther inward than the one below, until the opening could be closed at the top. The result is a high, beehive-like interior. Niches open from the chamber walls. Staircases wind upward inside the masonry. Passages, upper rooms, terraces, and guard spaces appear in different combinations. More elaborate sites contain several towers linked by massive walls around a central keep, sometimes forming bastions with courtyards and multiple phases of construction. These are planned structures made by people who understood weight, balance, access, and local rock. The stones themselves can be immense. Many were used with limited shaping, selected and fitted according to size, with the heaviest blocks placed lower in the walls and smaller stones above. Some Nuraghi were built from basalt, others from limestone, granite, trachyte, or whatever suitable material the surrounding land provided. Their colours and textures vary, but their architectural language remains recognisable. Builders adapt the same idea to local geology, The result is variation within a shared tradition. That tradition lasts for centuries as communities enlarge towers, add walls, surround them with villages, abandon spaces, reopen others, and reuse monuments whose original builders had long since died. Even in ruin, the towers distort modern expectations of prehistoric Sardinia. Bronze Age Europe is often imagined through farms, timber houses, enclosures, and graves. Sardinia presents something heavier and more permanent. Its communities create a landscape of stone monuments with few close parallels in the Western Mediterranean. Repeated thousands of times, the towers become a system of presence. They mark where communities gather, where routes cross, where resources are watched, where ancestors may be remembered, and where a group makes itself visible to neighbours. A single tower can be interpreted as a residence or stronghold. Thousands force a wider question about how an island organised identity. That question became more difficult as excavations improved. Early observers often treated the Nuraghi as fortresses, and the resemblance is understandable. Thick walls, elevated positions, narrow entrances, internal stairs, and commanding views all seem defensive. Some complexes look unmistakably martial. Yet many towers do not occupy ideal military positions. Some are too close together to represent independent castles. Others contain evidence of food preparation, storage, craftwork, ritual activity, and repeated domestic use. Some sites develop into settlements. Others appear tied to display, ceremony, or control of resources. Scholars still debate how much importance should be given to defense, status, residence, religion, and communal gathering. No single explanation fully accounts for this enormous and varied tradition. The mystery is not that archaeologists know nothing. Much is known. Nuraghi are rooted in the Bronze Age, especially the 2nd millennium BCE, though their use and symbolic importance continue into later periods. Their builders belong to what is broadly called Nuragic civilization, a term for many communities rather than a single kingdom. They raise livestock, cultivate crops, mine and work metals, produce distinctive pottery, exchange goods across the sea, and create sanctuaries, villages, tombs, bronze figurines, and monumental sculpture. But the towers sit at the centre of this world like a language whose grammar is partly understood and whose full meaning remains beyond reach. Near sunset, their doorways become black again. The walls catch the last light while the interiors disappear into shadow. From a ruined terrace, the surrounding country spreads outward in long ridges, dry valleys, and distant blue mountains. It is easy to imagine the tower as a lookout, harder to imagine it as a home, and harder still to hold all its possible meanings at once. Yet that is what the evidence demands. These structures were not frozen objects with one function for all time. They were built, altered, inhabited, defended, honoured, abandoned, reused, and remembered. To understand why they surprised archaeologists, the story must begin before the first great tower rose, in an island already crowded with tombs, villages, sacred places, and traditions of building in stone. Long before Sardinia's skyline filled with towers, its inhabitants were already transforming the island with stone. The Nuraghi did not appear suddenly in an empty landscape, nor did their builders invent monumentality from nothing. For thousands of years, communities had marked the ground with tombs, carved chambers, standing stones, sacred enclosures, and settlements whose remains reveal a deep familiarity with the island's terrain. By the time the first true Nuraghi rose during the Bronze Age, Sardinians already possessed generations of experience in organising labour, moving heavy materials, honouring the dead, and turning natural places into social landmarks. Sardinia had been settled by farming communities since the Neolithic, when agriculture and animal husbandry spread through the Western Mediterranean. These early inhabitants lived in small settlements, cultivated cereals, kept sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs, and relied heavily on obsidian from Monteati. This dark volcanic glass could be fractured into blades sharper than many metal tools, and Sardinian obsidian travelled across the sea to Corsica, mainland Italy, and parts of southern France. Its movement shows that the island was never as isolated as it can appear on a modern map. Seaways linked rather than separated communities, carrying raw materials, techniques, objects, and ideas between coastlines. Over time, Sardinian societies developed distinctive burial traditions. Among the most striking were rock-cut tombs later called Domus de Janus, houses of the fairies in local folklore. Thousands were carved into hillsides and exposed stone, sometimes as simple chambers and sometimes as elaborate underground complexes with several rooms. Their interiors could imitate the architecture of houses, including carved roof beams, doorways, pillars, and symbolic features. The dead were not placed in anonymous holes but in carefully constructed spaces resembling homes. This suggests that burial, ancestry, and domestic life were closely connected. The tomb became a permanent dwelling for the dead and perhaps a place where the living returned to perform ceremonies. Standing stones and carved statues also appeared in parts of the island. Menhirs were raised individually or in groups, while anthropomorphic stone figures represented human forms in increasingly stylized ways. Some carried symbols interpreted as weapons, status markers, or signs of identity, though scholars still debate their exact meanings. These monuments reveal communities already using stone to communicate across generations. A cultivated field might be abandoned, and a wooden house might decay, but a carved slab or chambered tomb continued to occupy the landscape. It reminded later inhabitants that others had lived there before them, and that particular places possessed inherited significance. During the later Neolithic and Copper Age, Sardinia contained several regional cultural traditions rather than one unified political society. Pottery styles, burial customs, settlement patterns, and tools varied across time and place. Archaeologists assign names to these traditions for the sake of study, but the people themselves almost certainly identified with families, villages, territories, and networks that left no written labels. What survives suggests repeated cycles of contact and local adaptation. New methods of metalworking appeared. Copper objects became more common, though stone remained essential. Communities continued farming and herding while participating in exchanges extending beyond the island. One of the most unusual monuments from this long pre-Nuragic world is Monte de Codi in northwestern Sardinia. It resembles a raised platform approached by a ramp, and its form has sometimes been compared to a Mesopotamian step structure. Such comparisons have encouraged dramatic theories of migration from the eastern Mediterranean, but direct connections remain unsupported. The monument is better understood within Sardinia's own developing ritual landscape. Even if its precise purpose is uncertain, its existence is important because it demonstrates that island communities were capable of coordinating substantial construction long before the Nuraghi. Large-scale building, communal ceremony, and the reshaping of terrain were already established parts of Sardinian life. As the 3rd millennium BCE gave way to the 2nd, social patterns began to change. Settlements became increasingly concerned with defensible positions, access to pasture, reliable water, and control of useful land. Copper was joined by bronze, an alloy that required access to both copper and tin. Sardinia possessed important mineral resources, especially copper and lead, though the sources of all metals used on the island remain debated. Metallurgy encouraged specialized knowledge and wider exchange. A skilled metalworker could produce axes, daggers, ornaments, and tools with qualities that stone could not easily match. Possession of metal may also have become a visible sign of status. The dead continued to shape the world of the living. Collective tombs known as giants' graves emerged from earlier burial traditions and became closely associated with Nuragic communities. Their long stone chambers and monumental facade were designed for repeated burials rather than individual kings. The name comes from later folklore, not from evidence that unusually large people were interred there. Their scale nevertheless suggests communal investment. Families or larger groups returned to the same burial places over generations, reinforcing shared ancestry and attachment to territory. In a society without written deeds or boundary maps, monuments could help establish who belonged to a place. Before the familiar round towers, Sardinia also saw the construction of buildings often called proto-Nuraghi, corridor Nuraghi, or archaic Nuraghi. These structures were generally lower, broader, and less regular than later tower Nuraghi. Instead of a tall central chamber with a corbelled vault, many contained corridors, small cells, platforms, and irregular internal spaces. Their dates and developmental relationships remain subjects of debate, but they seem to represent an important architectural transition. Communities were experimenting with massive stone buildings before settling on the vertical tower form that would come to dominate the island. These early structures already required planning beyond the needs of a single household. Stone had to be quarried or collected, transported, sorted, and placed. Builders needed food while working, tools had to be maintained, and the labour of construction had to fit around planting, harvesting, and herding. Such projects reveal cooperation, though cooperation does not necessarily imply kings or forced labour. A village could mobilise through kinship, obligation, competition, religious duty, or shared need. The evidence remains incomplete, and several forms of authority may have existed simultaneously. By the opening centuries of the Bronze Age, Sardinia had therefore accumulated all the essential ingredients for the tower-building phenomenon's skilled stoneworkers: communal labour traditions, ancestral monuments, regional rivalry, maritime contacts, metal resources, and communities increasingly invested in permanent places. The first Nuraghi were not a break from this history, but its dramatic concentration. Old habits of building outward across the land began to turn upward. Corridors became chambers, platforms became towers, and stone monuments once centred mainly on the dead began to stand at the heart of the living landscape. Once the tower form emerged, Sardinian builders pushed it with remarkable confidence. A nurag was not simply a heap of stones arranged into a round wall. It was a carefully balanced structure in which enormous weight had to be directed downward and inward without mortar, concrete, or a true arch. Every block mattered. The walls thickened toward the base, the inner chamber narrowed as it rose, and the outer profile leaned subtly toward the centre. The builders worked with gravity rather than against it, creating monuments that could survive earthquakes, storms, abandonment, and thousands of years of reuse. Construction began with the landscape itself. A site had to offer stable ground, access to stone, and a position that served the needs of the community. In some cases, bedrock was incorporated directly into the foundations. Elsewhere, the ground was levelled and prepared before the first courses were laid. The larger stones were generally placed at the bottom, where their mass helped stabilise the walls. These blocks could weigh several tons, and some were only roughly shaped. Their irregularity was not evidence of carelessness. Builders selected stones whose natural surfaces could fit together, filling smaller gaps with wedges and fragments while maintaining the wall's overall strength. Moving such material required organisation. There is no surviving Nuragic manual describing the process, and scholars still debate the exact methods used at individual sites. Timber rollers, sledges, ropes, ramps, levers, and teams of people or draft animals may all have played roles. The distance between quarry and construction site varied. In many places, suitable rock lay close at hand, reducing the need for long transport. Even then, lifting and positioning the heaviest blocks demanded patience and coordination. A stone did not have to be raised to the full height of a tower all at once. Earthen ramps could grow alongside the walls, allowing blocks to be dragged upward as construction progressed. The central chamber was the architectural heart of a typical tower nuraga. It was usually circular or slightly irregular, entered through a narrow passage cut through the massive outer wall. Above, the chamber rose into a corbelled vault. Each new ring of masonry projected inward slightly beyond the course below it. The opening became narrower until a final slab or small group of stones closed the roof. This technique placed the stones mainly under compression, a condition in which rock performs extremely well. It also avoided the need for large wooden beams, which would eventually rot or burn. From inside, the effect can be unexpectedly elegant. The rough walls curve upward into shadow, creating a vertical space far taller than the entrance suggests. Small niches open from the lower chamber, perhaps used for storage, lamps, objects, or activities that varied from site to site. The entrance passage sometimes contains a side chamber, traditionally described as a guard room, though its function is not certain in every case. Above the doorway, a small opening may help relieve pressure from the masonry and admit a limited amount of light. The engineering is practical, but it also creates atmosphere. A person entering from the bright Sardinian sun moves suddenly into cool darkness beneath hundreds of tons of stone. One of the most impressive features is the staircase hidden inside the wall. It climbs in a spiral or curving path between the inner chamber and the exterior face, connecting lower rooms with upper floors and terraces. The builders had to preserve enough mass on both sides of the stairway to keep the structure stable. They also had to calculate the changing angle as the tower narrowed. Some staircases are steep and confined, their ceilings formed by sloping slabs. Others are broad enough for movement with tools, goods, or weapons. Their presence proves that the surviving ruins often represent only the lower portion of buildings that once possessed additional levels. Many towers originally stood significantly higher than they do today. Some may have risen more than 15 meters, and major central keeps perhaps approached or exceeded 20 meters, although exact reconstructions remain uncertain. Upper chambers could repeat the corbelled form of the rooms below. Roof terraces offered views across fields, routes, neighbouring settlements, and distant towers. Parapets or projecting wooden structures may have existed, but organic materials rarely survive, leaving the stone skeleton behind. Reconstructions must therefore remain cautious. What is clear is that the towers were once more vertical, more complex, and more visually dominant than their weathered remains suggest. At larger sites, the central tower became only the beginning. Additional towers were built around it and connected by thick curtain walls, producing triangular, quadrangular, or more irregular bastions. Courtyards formed between the structures. Passages linked rooms and stairways. Wells or cisterns supplied water within the complex. Some buildings were altered repeatedly, with new walls placed against older ones and access routes redirected. These changes show that construction could continue across generations. A community inherited a tower, then enlarged it, reinforced it, or transformed its internal use. The famous complex at Nuragic at Barumini illustrates this layered growth. Its central tower was surrounded by 4 outer towers joined by a defensive-looking bastion, while a large settlement later expanded around it. Yet even there, the building sequence is complicated, and the monument did not serve one unchanged purpose throughout its life. Architecture that begins as a statement of authority or protection may later become a residence, ceremonial focus, refuge, storage center, or symbol of ancestry. The stones remain, but the activities around them shift. The labor invested in such structures was immense, though it should not be imagined as endless crowds working under a single ruler. Many Nuraghi could have been built by relatively small communities over extended periods. Seasonal labor may have been organized when agricultural demands were lower. Skilled masons directed less specialized workers. Knowledge passed through observation and practice rather than written plans. Mistakes were corrected in stone, and successful techniques were repeated from valley to valley. A lesser-known detail is that Nuragic builders did not follow one rigid blueprint. Chambers vary in proportion. Staircases turn differently. entrances face different directions, and complex Nuraghi grow according to local needs. This flexibility suggests a shared architectural tradition rather than centralized standardization. Builders understood a common system, but each community adapted it. The result was not mass production. It was thousands of individual solutions built from the same powerful idea. When completed, a new tower would have changed the appearance of its surroundings immediately. It rose above low houses, fields, and pasture like a permanent claim on the horizon. Its construction demonstrated technical knowledge, collective effort, and access to labour. Yet engineering alone does not explain why so many communities chose this form. The towers could be built. The more difficult question was what all that stone was meant to accomplish. The first scholars who tried to explain the Nuraghi reached for the most obvious comparison available to them. Thick walls, narrow entrances, elevated positions, hidden staircases, and commanding views all seemed to belong to the language of defence. The towers looked like fortresses, and so they were described as fortresses, in an age when archaeology often searched for kings, wars, invasions, and heroic peoples. The interpretation felt natural. Sardinia's Bronze Age was imagined as a landscape divided among warrior chiefs, each controlling a stone stronghold from which territory could be watched and enemies resisted. This explanation gained strength from the appearance of the larger complexes. A central keep surrounded by subsidiary towers and curtain walls resembles a castle even to modern eyes. Access could be restricted through narrow corridors. Internal wells provided water during danger. Elevated terraces allowed wide observation. Massive masonry could resist attack far better than ordinary houses of wood, mud, and thatch. Some sites stand on ridges, rocky spurs, or heights where movement through the surrounding land is easy to monitor. To early investigators, these were not merely similarities, they seemed like proof. The language used to describe the buildings reinforced the idea. Central towers became keeps, side rooms became guard chambers, outer walls became bastions. Openings were interpreted as defensive loopholes. Such terms created a complete military picture before every feature had been tested against archaeological evidence. Once a monument is called a castle, every dark passage begins to look strategic, every narrow entrance becomes a security measure, every elevated position becomes a watch point. The interpretation can become difficult to escape because the vocabulary itself guides the imagination. There were good reasons for taking conflict seriously. Bronze Age societies across the Mediterranean knew warfare, raiding, competition, and violence. Metal weapons were produced and exchanged. Communities defended livestock, crops, water, trade routes, and access to mineral resources. Sardinia was not a peaceful world outside history. Human remains from prehistoric contexts sometimes preserve evidence of injury, though the overall pattern is incomplete. Bronze swords, daggers, spearheads, and later warrior figurines demonstrate that martial identities existed. A tower capable of providing protection would have been valuable, particularly during raids or local disputes. The Nuraghi may also have served as refuges. The surrounding population did not necessarily live permanently inside the tower. During moments of danger, people could gather within thick walls while animals, goods, and food were brought into nearby enclosed spaces. Upper levels offered defenders an advantage over anyone approaching from below. Even a small group could control a restricted doorway. Stone does not burn easily, and a structure with its own water source could endure conditions that would destroy an ordinary settlement. No serious interpretation can dismiss these defensive possibilities. Yet the fortress model carried assumptions that extended beyond architecture. If the towers were castles, then they seemed to require lords. If they had lords, the island could be divided into small chiefdoms ruled from fortified seats. Larger complexes might belong to more powerful leaders, while simple towers represented lesser figures. This created a familiar social pyramid: elites at the top, dependents below, enemies beyond the walls. It was a neat picture. and neat pictures are especially attractive when written records are absent. Some early theories went further and treated the Nuraghi as products of foreign conquerors. Their unusual form encouraged comparisons with structures elsewhere in the Mediterranean and beyond. Phoenicians, Mycenaeans, peoples from the eastern Mediterranean, and other outsiders were proposed as builders or sources of the architectural idea. Such explanations often reflected an older tendency to assume that impressive prehistoric achievements required influence from supposedly more advanced civilizations. Sardinia's communities were cast as recipients rather than innovators. Later research has steadily weakened these diffusionist claims. The development from earlier Sardinian stone structures to corridor Nuraghi and then tower Nuraghi points strongly toward local evolution. Overseas contact certainly mattered, especially as Mediterranean exchange intensified. But contact does not mean that foreign engineers arrived to teach Sardinians how to build. The architecture is deeply adapted to local stone, terrain, settlement history, and social traditions. What survives in the records suggests experimentation within the island over generations. The military interpretation nevertheless remained powerful because some sites genuinely look defensive. Nuraghi Arubiu, for example, developed into a vast complex with a central tower, multiple surrounding towers, thick walls, courtyards, and an extensive settlement. Its scale suggests control, authority, and the ability to coordinate considerable labour. Other complexes dominate routes between uplands and plains, or overlook productive valleys. It would be strange to argue that position and defence played no role at all. The difficulty lies in turning a possible function into a universal one. A structure can be defensible without being built mainly for war, a farmhouse can be fortified, a temple can control access, a residence can display power through massive walls. A communal storehouse can be protected because its contents matter. The Nuraghi may have combined these purposes, and the balance could change from one location to another, even within the life of a single monument. Defensive importance may have risen or fallen. Another problem is that true fortresses usually exist within clear systems of conflict. One expects barriers, controlled roads, concentrations along borders, signs of destruction, weapon deposits, or settlement patterns shaped overwhelmingly by danger. Sardinia provides some of these clues in certain places, but not consistently enough to make every tower part of one island-wide military network. Many Nuraghi stand in positions that are useful, but not exceptionally defensible. Some lie in open agricultural zones, others are overlooked by nearby heights. A tower placed below a ridge may be impressive, but it is not an ideal stronghold against attackers occupying the ground above. The old fortress model also struggles with sheer numbers. If every Nuragh belonged to a separate warrior chief, then parts of Sardinia would have contained an extraordinary density of miniature lordships. Some towers are so close that their supposed territories would overlap almost immediately. This could indicate intense local competition, but it could also mean that the buildings served social units smaller or more flexible than independent states, households, clans, seasonal groups, or communities sharing land may each have invested in monuments without behaving like rival kingdoms. Excavation added further complications. Inside and around Nuraghi, archaeologists found evidence not only of weapons and barriers but of cooking, storage, grinding, craft production, animal management, and repeated domestic activity. Hearths blackened floors, pottery accumulated through ordinary use. Tools suggested work rather than constant vigilance. Some towers became surrounded by villages so closely integrated with them that separating military and domestic space became artificial. The fortress interpretation was not entirely wrong. Its mistake was certainty. It recognized the protective strength of the towers but reduced them to that strength alone. The Nuraghi could resist attack, but they also housed food, people, memory, labor, ceremony, and authority. As more sites were mapped and compared, the island itself began to challenge the image of thousands of isolated castles. The towers formed a landscape, and that landscape refused to behave like a simple battlefield. Seen one at a time, a Nuraghi can easily resemble a fortress. Seen across the whole island, that explanation begins to fracture. Sardinia does not contain a handful of strategic strongholds placed at obvious points of control. It contains thousands of towers spread across coastlines, plateaus, valleys, river basins, mountain slopes, grazing land, and cultivated plains. Some occupy dramatic heights. Others stand in locations that offer little military advantage. A few dominate long approaches. Many are overlooked by nearby ground. The pattern is too dense, too varied, and too deeply woven into ordinary landscapes to fit a single defensive design. This becomes clear in regions where several Nuraghi are visible from the same point. Their spacing can be remarkably close, sometimes only a short walk apart. If each tower belonged to an independent chief defending a separate territory, those territories would have been extremely small and constantly overlapping. Such competition is possible, especially in a fragmented society. But it does not explain why neighbouring communities would repeatedly invest enormous labour in structures that could observe one another without necessarily controlling much land between them. The towers appear less like isolated castles and more like markers within a shared social landscape. Visibility may still have mattered, though not only for warning of attack. A tower on the horizon announced that a community occupied the land below. It could be seen from fields, paths, grazing grounds, and neighbouring settlements. Its presence communicated permanence. A family or village that helped build such a monument could point to something that outlasted any single generation, even if the structure was not always inhabited. It remained a statement that the surrounding territory was known, used, remembered, and claimed. Some Nuraghi appear near springs, wells, and seasonal watercourses. Others stand beside productive soils or routes connecting upland pasture with lower agricultural zones. A tower positioned near water may have helped supervise access to a vital resource, but supervision does not always mean military exclusion. It may have served as a meeting point where rights were negotiated, herds gathered, goods exchanged, or seasonal movements organised. In a landscape where rainfall varies sharply and summer heat can be severe, reliable water carries social as well as practical value. The same is true of farmland. Fertile plains were worth protecting, yet the towers may also have helped divide, coordinate, and identify cultivated zones. Grain requires collective timing. Fields must be prepared, planted, harvested, processed, and stored. Livestock must be kept away from crops at certain times and allowed onto stubble at others. Disputes over boundaries or grazing would have been inevitable. A permanent stone structure could anchor agreements that were otherwise remembered through custom and ancestry. It might mark not a border in the modern sense, but a centre from which land use was understood. In several areas, towers cluster around routes through passes or along natural corridors. This has often been treated as evidence of surveillance, and sometimes it probably was. Yet roads in the Bronze Age were not paved lines with fixed checkpoints. Movement followed river valleys, ridges, coastlines, and seasonal paths. Nuraghi near these routes could have offered shelter, storage, hospitality, exchange, and information as well as control. Travellers approaching a settlement would see the tower before they saw the houses. It announced where people could be found and perhaps where permission, trade, or assistance might be sought. The relationship between towers is equally revealing. Some stand within visual range of larger complexes, suggesting hierarchy of sites. A major Nuraghi may have acted as a central place surrounded by smaller towers linked through kinship, exchange, ritual, or political obligation. Signals could certainly pass between them, perhaps by fire, smoke, sound, or simple line of sight. But scholars still debate whether these patterns represent coordinated defensive systems or something broader? Intervisibility may have connected communities symbolically as much as militarily. To see another tower was to see another group whose presence was familiar, whether friendly, rival, related, or all three at different times. Not every Nuraghi was occupied continuously. Some show long sequences of use, repair, and rebuilding. Others may have been seasonal, temporary, or abandoned for generations before being reused. This uneven history matters because a static map can create the illusion that all towers functioned at the same moment. In reality, construction and occupation stretched across centuries. A dense cluster may combine older monuments, active residences, ceremonial sites, and structures already falling into ruin. The landscape was layered through time, not built according to one master plan. Differences in size deepen the problem. A simple single tower required far less labour than a multi-towered complex with courtyards and surrounding walls. This variation may reflect differences in population, wealth, status, or function. Yet small does not necessarily mean poor, and large does not automatically mean royal. Some modest towers occupy highly visible positions. Some major complexes sit near resources rather than borders. Communities could enlarge monuments when circumstances changed, adding towers and walls to structures that had begun more simply. The architecture preserves history as accumulated masonry. The surrounding terrain also changes over thousands of years. Forest cover, fields, paths, water availability, and settlement density were not identical to those of modern Sardinia. A tower that now appears isolated may once have stood amid cultivated land or near houses built from perishable materials. A site that seems to command an open view may once have been partly concealed by woodland. Reconstructing visibility requires caution. Modern observers see ruins in a landscape altered by erosion, farming, road building, deforestation, and the movement of communities. Even so, one fact remains difficult to avoid: the towers were embedded in everyday life. They were not pushed only to remote frontiers or concentrated solely around coastlines vulnerable to invasion. They spread through the inhabited heart of the island. Their locations often correspond with places where people farmed, grazed animals, gathered water, crossed valleys, and buried their dead. This suggests that the Nuraghi helped organize the ordinary rhythms of society, even when they also provided defense. A lesser-known possibility is that some towers served as landmarks within systems of oral geography. Without written maps, communities relied on memory, stories, visible features, and repeated movement through the terrain. A tower could identify a pasture, a lineage territory, a meeting place, or a route toward water. Its name and associations may have carried information now completely lost. The monument did not merely occupy space, it helped make space meaningful. No single distribution pattern explains every site. Some Nuraghi truly dominate strategic ground. Some are closely tied to settlements. Others seem connected to resources, ritual places, or territorial boundaries. The evidence remains incomplete because many towers have never been fully excavated, and countless surrounding structures lie buried or destroyed. What survives, however, makes one conclusion increasingly clear. Sardinia's stone towers cannot be understood only as responses to fear. They were also responses to belonging. Their positions reveal a society mapping itself onto the island, one monument at a time. The strongest challenge to the image of the Nuraghi as nothing more than a fortress comes from the flaws beneath its walls. Stone preserves architecture, but daily life survives in fragments soot from hearths, broken cooking pots, animal bones, grain processing tools, storage vessels, spindle whorls, metal scraps, and layers of ash built up through repeated occupation. These remains are rarely dramatic. They do not resemble treasure, and many were discarded by the people who used them. Yet they reveal what happened when the tower was not under attack, which appears to have been most of the time. Inside some Nuraghi, excavators have found hearths placed directly on chamber floors. Fire warmed the interior, provided light, and allowed food to be cooked beneath the corbelled roof. Smoke may have escaped through the entrance or openings higher in the structure, though ventilation must often have been poor. The walls would have darkened over time. Lamps could extend activity into the night, while niches stored small objects or vessels. The chamber that appears solemn and mysterious today may once have been crowded with voices, tools, baskets, smoke, children, and the smell of cooked grain or meat. Pottery is among the most common traces of this ordinary world. Bowls, jars, cups, pans, and large containers appear in different forms across time and region. Some held water or grain. Others were used for cooking, serving, fermentation, or transport. Broken vessels accumulated where people prepared meals and stored supplies. The pottery is useful to archaeologists because styles changed over time, helping establish phases of occupation. It also reveals that the Nuraghi were not empty monuments visited only for exceptional ceremonies. At many sites, people handled food and drink repeatedly within or beside the tower. Grinding stones offer another clue. Grain had to be crushed into flour or meal before it could become bread, porridge, or other foods. This was slow, physical labour, probably performed regularly near domestic areas. The presence of querns, handstones, and food processing debris places routine agricultural work close to monumental architecture. A fortified tower may store provisions for emergencies, but grinding grain is not an emergency activity. It belongs to the daily cycle of preparation, consumption, and replenishment. Animal bones deepen the picture. Sheep and goats were central to Sardinian pastoral life, providing meat, milk, hides, and wool. Cattle and pigs also appear, along with hunted animals in smaller quantities. Cut marks and burning can reveal butchery and cooking. The distribution of bones may indicate ordinary meals, communal feasts, ritual deposits, or waste thrown aside after consumption. These categories sometimes overlap. A gathering involving shared meat could be domestic, political, and sacred at the same time. Modern distinctions between household activity and ceremony may not fit neatly inside a Bronze Age community. Storage appears to have been especially important. Large jars, raised surfaces, side rooms, and protected internal spaces could hold grain, oil, dried food, tools, weapons, textiles, or valuables. Thick stone walls moderated temperature and shielded contents from weather, animals, and theft. If several households contributed supplies, the tower may have functioned as a communal store. Control over stored food would carry power, particularly during drought, poor harvests, or conflict. The person or group managing access might gain authority without resembling a king in the later Mediterranean sense. Wells and cisterns found within some major complexes strengthened this independence. Water could be collected or drawn without leaving the enclosed structure. During danger, this had obvious defensive value, but in ordinary times it also supported cooking, craftwork, animals, and large gatherings. At Sunuraxi and other elaborate sites, internal water systems suggest that the tower complex was designed to sustain repeated human activity. The architecture was not merely a shell for warriors. It was an environment in which people could work, store, meet, and endure. Craft production also entered these spaces. Spindle whorls and loom weights point to the making of textiles. Although wood, wool, and plant fibers rarely survive, metalworking debris, moulds, crucibles, or fragments sometimes appear in associated settlements and occasionally near the towers themselves. Bone and antler were shaped into tools. Stone implements were repaired and reused even after bronze became common. These activities required skill and time, and their presence suggests that the Nuraghi stood near the productive centre of community life rather than apart from it. The internal arrangement may have organised different kinds of work. A central chamber could host gatherings or food preparation, while niches and upper rooms held supplies. Staircases connected spaces with different levels of privacy or access. The upper terrace might be used for observation, drying food, signalling, or tasks requiring sunlight and wind. Yet the exact use of each room remains uncertain, because functions changed and objects were moved. A niche containing pottery in its final phase may have served an entirely different purpose centuries earlier. One surprising detail is how adaptable these interiors became. Floors were raised, hearths relocated, entrances narrowed, rooms blocked, and new spaces opened through later alterations. Communities did not preserve the original design as untouchable architecture. They modified it according to changing needs. A chamber that began as a prestigious meeting place could later become storage. A defensive passage could become a work area. An abandoned tower might be reused by people who no longer understood every intention of its builders, but still recognized the monument's practical and symbolic value. Occupation was not always comfortable. The rooms could be dark, cramped, smoky, and damp. Their impressive height did not create generous floor space. This makes it unlikely that large populations lived permanently inside most towers. Ordinary houses around them probably accommodated the majority of inhabitants. The Nuraghi may instead have sheltered a leading household. Guards, specialists, stored resources, or activities requiring controlled access. At certain moments, more people could gather within or around it, but the tower itself was not an apartment block. The domestic evidence, therefore, does not replace the fortress interpretation with a simple claim that every Nuraghi was a house. It reveals a mixture: protection, residence, storage, administration, production, and ceremony could occupy the same building. In societies without modern institutional boundaries, the home of a powerful lineage might also be a meeting hall, storehouse, defensive refuge, and sacred place. The tower's strength made it useful, while its monumentality made every activity inside it socially significant. When archaeologists follow the broken pottery and worn tools outward, the dark chamber opens into a much larger human setting. Around many towers lie circles of collapsed stone, narrow lanes, courtyards, workshops, and meeting places. What first appears to be an isolated fortress becomes the centre of a settlement. The tower was not simply watching the community from above, it was embedded within it, surrounded by the houses and working spaces of the people whose labour had raised it. Beyond the tower walls, the settlement begins to take shape as a dense arrangement of circular houses, narrow passages, courtyards, working areas, and shared spaces built outward over generations. At many sites, these villages did not appear all at once. A few huts gathered near the Nuraghi. The new buildings filled the gaps. Older walls were reused, and paths shifted as the population grew. The resulting pattern can seem irregular to modern eyes, but it reflects a living place rather than a planned monument. Families built where room remained, adapting to slope, stone, water, and the presence of structures already regarded as permanent. The typical house was far less imposing than the tower. It was usually circular, with a low stone foundation supporting walls and a roof made partly from perishable materials such as timber, branches, reeds, clay, and thatch. These upper elements rarely survive, leaving rings of masonry that once enclosed warm, active interiors. Hearths occupied central or side positions, benches ran along walls, niches held containers and tools, grinding stones, pottery, spindle whorls, and animal bones accumulated across floors. Some houses consisted of a single room, while others developed into larger compounds containing several connected chambers around a small courtyard. These domestic compounds reveal that the village was not simply a collection of identical huts. Different rooms supported different activities. One might be used for sleeping, another for cooking, another for storing food or equipment. Covered spaces protected people during rain, while courtyards provided light and room for work that produced smoke, dust, or waste. Families could process grain, repair tools, prepare hides, spin wool, and manage food close to their homes. The settlement was filled with labour, much of it repetitive and essential, performed in the shadow of architecture that modern visitors often notice first. The relationship between houses and tower varied. At some sites, dwellings clustered tightly around the Nuraghi, almost enclosing it. At others, the village spread across a wider area, with open spaces between domestic groups. The tower might remain visible from nearly every lane, or it might disappear behind later construction. Its entrance could face a courtyard used by many households or open toward a restricted zone. These differences suggest that the social role of the monument was not fixed. In one settlement, it may have stood at the centre of communal life. In another, access may have been controlled by a smaller group. Larger villages contained specialised buildings whose design set them apart from ordinary houses. One important type is the so-called meeting hut, often larger than neighbouring structures and equipped with a stone bench running around the interior wall. People seated there would face inward, creating a space suited to councils, ceremonies, negotiations, feasting, or the distribution of goods. Some contained a central basin or model of a Nuraghi, objects that gave the room symbolic importance. The precise activities remain uncertain, but the architecture suggests organised gatherings rather than private household life. Such meeting spaces complicate the search for rulers. Decisions may have been made collectively by elders, lineage heads, warriors, ritual specialists, or representatives of important families. Authority could be negotiated rather than absolute. A circular room with seating around its edge creates no obvious throne at the centre. This does not prove equality, and status differences certainly existed. But it suggests political practices that may have depended on assembly and consensus as much as command. The monument outside displayed collective strength. The room within the village may have been where that strength was debated and directed. Workshops added another layer. Areas associated with pottery production, metalworking, stone shaping, and textile preparation have been identified in or near some settlements. Metalworking was especially significant because bronze required knowledge of heat, fuel, alloying, moulds, and finishing. Furnaces and crucibles created smoke and danger, so production may have been placed away from the most crowded domestic spaces. Craftspeople likely held valued knowledge, though whether they worked independently, for leading families, or on behalf of the wider community remains debated. Livestock also shaped village life. Sheep and goats had to be moved between pasture, shelter, water, and milking areas. Cattle required more space and fodder. Pigs could feed near settlements but damaged crops if uncontrolled. Stone enclosures, open yards, and spaces at the edge of habitation may have helped manage animals, particularly at night or during vulnerable seasons. The presence of dung, insects, noise, and strong smells would have made these villages very different from the silent ruins seen today. The Nuraghi did not stand over an empty ceremonial landscape. It stood amid animals, smoke, voices, and constant movement. Water determined where people could remain for long periods. Wells, springs, cisterns, and collection systems supported households and herds. Carrying water was daily work, especially during dry months. A reliable source close to the village reduced labour and strengthened attachment to the site. Some settlements developed around wells of practical use, while others stood near sacred water places whose significance extended beyond survival. The same source could be both necessary and revered, because dependence often gives rise to ritual importance. Waste accumulated around the houses, broken pottery, ash, bones, discarded tools, and construction debris were swept into pits, corners, or abandoned rooms. These deposits allow archaeologists to reconstruct diet, craft, trade, and changing habits. They also reveal that village space was repeatedly cleaned, repaired, and reorganized. Houses were abandoned and rebuilt, doorways were blocked, walls were reused as foundations. A settlement might contract during one period and expand during another. Its history survives not as a single moment but as overlapping layers of human decisions. One lesser-known feature of some Nuragic villages is the presence of carefully constructed communal basins, paved areas, and buildings whose functions remain difficult to identify. They may have supported ritual washing, food preparation, craft production, or public ceremonies. No single explanation fully accounts for their variety. Their existence nevertheless shows that village life included spaces not owned or used like ordinary homes. Communities invested labor in places where people met, performed shared tasks, and expressed collective identity. The villages therefore transform the meaning of the towers. A Nuraghi surrounded by houses cannot be understood only as a lonely military post. It becomes a focal point around which daily life is organized. Its stored goods, protected chambers, elevated terraces, and ancestral presence would affect everyone living nearby. Children grew up beneath it. Craftspeople worked within sight of it. Animals passed along its walls. Gatherings took place beside it. And the dead were buried in the wider landscape beyond. Yet this intimacy creates a more difficult mystery. If the tower belonged to the entire settlement, who decided when it would be built, who controlled its entrance, and who commanded the labor needed to enlarge it? The village reveals cooperation, but cooperation does not erase power. Somewhere within these rings of houses, authority had to take form, even if it left no throne and no written name. The labor behind a Nuraghi makes authority impossible to ignore. Stone had to be selected, moved, lifted, and fitted. Food had to support the workers. Herding, planting, harvesting, and household tasks had to continue while part of the community devoted time to construction. Skilled builders needed to direct people who understood less about masonry, and someone had to decide where the monument would stand, how large it would become, and when additional towers or walls should be added. Yet for all this organization, Nuragic Sardinia has not produced clear evidence of kings comparable to those known from contemporary states elsewhere in the Mediterranean. There are no surviving palaces filled with administrative tablets. No royal tombs dominate the landscape with the names of rulers. No carved inscriptions proclaim military victories, divine ancestry, or ownership of entire regions. Wealth existed, and social inequality almost certainly existed with it. But power does not appear in the familiar costume of a centralized monarchy. The absence of that costume has made Nuragic society difficult to reconstruct, because archaeologists must recognize forms of leadership that may not have depended on courts, bureaucracies, or hereditary kingship. One possibility is that authority rested with leading households or lineages, a family controlling livestock, productive land, metal resources, trade connections, or stored grain could gain influence over neighbors. Its members might organize construction, sponsor feasts, settle disputes, and represent the settlement in dealings with other communities. The tower could serve as their residence and stronghold, while also functioning as a communal storehouse and symbol. In such a system, the distinction between private and public power would be blurred. The leading household success might be presented as the community's success because both were tied to the same monument. Yet the enormous number of Nuraghi suggests that authority was widely distributed. Instead of a small number of kings ruling large territories, Sardinia may have contained many local centres led by chiefs, councils, elders, or coalitions of important families. These centres could cooperate in one generation and compete in the next. Their boundaries were probably flexible, shaped by marriage, seasonal movement, access to pasture, and the shifting strength of alliances. A powerful leader might dominate several nearby settlements without creating a permanent state. After death, influence could pass to relatives, rivals, or an assembly, rather than automatically to a crowned heir. Communal participation may have been just as important as elite command. Building a tower was not merely a burden imposed from above, it could provide security, storage, prestige, and a visible claim to land for everyone associated with it. People may have worked because the monument represented their ancestors and their future. Construction could also strengthen relationships through shared labour, food, and ceremony. The act of building was itself political. It brought households together, established obligations, and made cooperation visible in stone. Competition between communities may have encouraged ever greater construction. Once one settlement raised an impressive tower, neighbouring groups had reason to respond. A larger or more elaborate Nuraghi demonstrated access to labour and resources. It warned rivals without requiring actual warfare and attracted allies, marriage partners, traders, or dependents. Monumental building could therefore function as controlled rivalry, instead of proving power mainly through destruction. Communities proved it through the ability to organize creation. Feasting may have played a central role in this process. Large gatherings required animals, grain, drink, vessels, fuel, and spaces where food could be prepared and shared. A successful feast allowed leaders to display generosity while turning stored wealth into social loyalty. Meat distributed publicly created obligation. Guests remembered who had hosted them, who had received honoured portions, and who had been excluded. Archaeological deposits of animal bones and serving vessels may sometimes preserve traces of such events, though distinguishing political feasting from ordinary communal meals remains difficult. Control over metal added another source of influence. Sardinia possessed valuable mineral resources and became deeply involved in Mediterranean exchange. Those who managed access to ores, craftspeople, finished weapons, and overseas contacts could accumulate prestige. Bronze axes, swords, ornaments, and tools were practical objects, but they were also visible expressions of wealth and connection. Metal could be gifted, exchanged, deposited in sanctuaries, or hidden in hoards. Its circulation created networks of dependence that may have extended beyond the authority of any single tower. Religious knowledge offered another path to leadership. Ritual specialists may have supervised ceremonies connected with water, ancestors, healing, seasonal change, or communal protection. Their authority would not necessarily be separate from political power. A leading family might claim special ties to sacred places or ancestral founders. The tower itself could embody those claims. Its age, height, and permanence gave it an authority no living individual could possess alone. Leaders may have governed partly by presenting themselves as custodians of inherited tradition, rather than owners of the monument. The meeting huts found in some villages suggest that power could also be exercised through assembly. Stone benches arranged around a circular interior imply gatherings in which several participants faced one another. Important decisions may have required discussion among household heads, elders, warriors, or representatives of allied groups. Such meetings were not necessarily democratic in a modern sense. Rank, age, gender, wealth, and reputation probably shaped who could speak and whose opinion carried weight. Still, the architecture offers no obvious place for a distant monarch towering over subjects. Authority appears close, negotiated, and embedded in the community. Burial practices add to this impression. The giants' graves were collective monuments used for multiple individuals rather than spectacular tombs reserved for one ruler. This does not mean that everyone was treated equally. Certain bodies may have received special placement, offerings, or ceremonies that have left only faint traces, yet the visible emphasis remained on shared ancestry. The dead were gathered into communal structures, linking the living to a lineage or group rather than celebrating a single named king. Scholars still debate how hierarchical Nuragic society became, especially during the height of complex tower construction. Large sites almost certainly held greater influence than small ones, and some individuals possessed more wealth and authority than others. But no single explanation fully accounts for the evidence. Sardinia may have contained several political arrangements at the same time. One region could be dominated by powerful chiefs, another by competing lineages, and another by councils controlling shared resources. These systems could change as trade, population, warfare, and ritual importance shifted. What survives suggests power without an obvious throne. It appears in the ability to gather workers, control stores, sponsor feasts, manage metal, direct ceremonies, and speak for a community. It is visible in differences between simple towers and great bastions. Yet it remains difficult to attach to individual rulers. The Nuraghi may have been powerful precisely because it concealed personal authority inside collective identity. A leader died, but the tower remained. Families changed. Alliances broke, and generations passed, while the monument continued to represent the group as though its unity had always existed. That permanence eventually allowed the towers to become more than residences or strongholds. Their chambers accumulated memory, offerings, and associations with ancestors. As their original builders disappeared, later communities continued to approach them with respect. Political power had been built into the stone, but sacred meaning was beginning to gather there as well. Sacred meaning rarely announces the moment it enters a building. A tower may begin as a residence, refuge, storehouse, or seat of authority, then gradually acquire a different weight as generations pass through it. Fires burn on the same floors. Objects are placed in the same niches. Important decisions are made beneath the same vault. The people who ordered its construction die, but the monument remains, older than anyone living nearby. Its chambers become associated with ancestors, remembered events, and powers that cannot be separated easily from ordinary life. In Nuragic Sardinia, this slow accumulation of meaning may explain why some towers came to function not only as practical centres, but as sacred places. Archaeologists have uncovered ritual deposits inside and around certain Nuraghi, including pottery placed deliberately, animal remains arranged in unusual ways, metal objects, miniature vessels, and materials that do not resemble ordinary household waste. A broken cooking pot scattered across a floor may mark daily use. A carefully positioned object sealed beneath a later surface suggests intention, yet interpretation is difficult because ritual behavior often uses ordinary things: food, water, fire, weapons, and domestic vessels can become sacred through the circumstances in which they are offered. The object alone rarely explains the act. Some deposits appear connected to the foundation or rebuilding of structures. Communities may have placed offerings beneath walls, thresholds, or floors to mark construction, seek protection, or bind the building to ancestral powers. Similar practices are known from many prehistoric societies, but the exact beliefs behind Sardinian examples remain unknown. No prayer survives. No inscription identifies a deity. What survives in the record suggests that construction itself could be ceremonial, especially when a monument represented the continuity and safety of an entire group. The architecture encouraged controlled experience. Entering a nuragh meant passing from bright open ground into a narrow passage and then into a high, shadowed chamber. Sound changed beneath the corbelled roof. Voices could echo or deepen. Firelight moved across rough stone, while upper openings admitted only limited daylight. These effects were partly consequences of engineering, but they may have gained ritual importance. Spaces designed for storage or security could also create awe. A gathering inside the tower would feel enclosed by the labour of ancestors and by the enormous weight of the walls. Certain niches and chambers may have held revered objects, though scholars still debate how consistently this occurred. Weapons, metal figurines, vessels, or heirlooms could be displayed, stored, or brought out during ceremonies. Control over such objects would strengthen the authority of those permitted to handle them. A community's sacred possessions might also serve as evidence of its past, linking living leaders to founders whose names have disappeared. The tower could become a treasury of memory even when it was not a temple in the formal sense. Water added another dimension. Sardinia's climate made springs and wells essential, and the Nuragic world developed some of its most refined architecture around sacred water. Stone-lined well temples descended toward underground sources through carefully constructed stairways. Above them stood ceremonial buildings, open courts, and gathering spaces. The masonry could be precise, the approach deliberately arranged, and the reflection of light on water may have heightened the experience. These sanctuaries demonstrate that water was not treated only as a resource. It could become the focus of communal worship, healing, purification, seasonal observance, or political assembly. The relationship between sacred wells and Nuraghi is not always direct, but both belong to the same wider society. Communities that invested enormous labour in towers also built monuments around water and returned to them with offerings. Bronze figurines, weapons, ornaments, pottery, and other objects have been recovered from sanctuary contexts. Some offerings were valuable enough that their removal from circulation must have been deliberate. Giving metal to a sacred place transformed wealth into devotion, prestige, obligation, or all three at once. Fire may have carried comparable significance. Hearths inside towers were practical, yet repeated burning at particular locations could become ceremonial. Food prepared for a feast, animal sacrifice, lighting rituals, or offerings destroyed by flame may leave similar traces. Without written testimony, archaeologists must distinguish patterns from accidents, and certainty is rarely possible. A layer of ash may record a household meal, a communal rite, destruction during conflict, or the clearing of an abandoned room. Context matters, but context is often incomplete. The dead also remained close to sacred life. Giants' graves stood in the wider landscape, sometimes near settlements and towers. These collective tombs were places where the living could return, renew connections with ancestors, and reinforce claims to land. The Nuraghi, visible from such burial places, may have linked the community of the living with the community of the dead. One monument held the bodies of previous generations. The other embodied the enduring strength of the group they had founded. Later reuse provides some of the clearest evidence that Nuraghi outlived their original functions. Long after tower construction declined, communities continued entering, modifying, and sometimes venerating these places. Rooms could receive new floors, altars, lamps, offerings, or burials. A structure once occupied by leaders might become a shrine because its age itself inspired respect. The original purpose no longer needed to be remembered accurately. Ruins often generate sacred stories precisely because their makers are forgotten. Miniature models of Nuraghi reveal how powerful the tower form became as a symbol. These models appear in meeting spaces and sanctuaries, carved in stone or represented in bronze. They reduce monumental architecture to an object that can be carried, displayed, or placed at the center of ceremony. Some preserve features lost from surviving ruins, including upper terraces and projecting elements, offering clues about how full-size towers once appeared. More importantly, they show that people were not only using Nuraghi, they are thinking about them as symbols worthy of representation. A miniature tower might stand for a particular settlement, an ancestral community, authority, protection, or the social order itself. Its presence in a meeting hut could remind participants that decisions were made on behalf of a larger group. In a sanctuary, it might represent the community before the sacred powers receiving offerings. The image of the tower had become detached from one physical building and transformed into a shared emblem. This symbolic growth helps explain why a purely military interpretation feels insufficient. Fortresses can become sacred, especially after surviving danger or becoming associated with heroic ancestors. Residences can become temples when later generations remember their occupants as founders. Storehouses can become ritual centers when communal survival depends on what they contain. Nuraghi may have crossed all these boundaries because Nuragic society did not divide political, domestic, and religious life as sharply as modern institutions do. No single explanation fully accounts for the ritual evidence. Some towers may have hosted ceremonies regularly, while others remained primarily practical. Certain sacred deposits may belong to periods long after the original construction. Regional traditions differed, and the meaning of one site cannot simply be transferred to every other. Still, the stones show that these buildings carried more than physical weight. They concentrated memory and authority until the tower itself became a participant in community life. Once a monument could represent ancestors, protection, sacred power, and collective identity, its position in the landscape became even more significant. The tower did not merely occupy territory, it gave that territory a center, a history, and a visible claim that neighboring communities could recognize from miles away. A tower that becomes a symbol also becomes a point of reference. People describe fields in relation to it, follow paths toward it, recognize neighboring land by its silhouette, and measure distance by how long the monument remains visible behind them. Across Nuragic, Sardinia, the towers did more than occupy territory. They helped transform open country into an organized human landscape, one divided not by written maps or surveyed borders, but by memory, movement, resources, and the presence of communities whose claims were built into stone. Territory in the Bronze Age was rarely a clean shape enclosed by a permanent line. A village might control fields close to its houses while sharing distant pasture, woodland, water, or seasonal routes with neighboring groups. Rights could overlap. A family might cultivate one area, graze animals in another, and maintain ancestral ties to a tomb or sanctuary beyond both. Boundaries were probably known through landmarks, customary paths, agreements, and stories. A Nuraghi, visible and difficult to move, provided one of the strongest landmarks possible. Its position could identify the center of a community's world rather than its outer edge. From that center, daily movement spread toward farmland, wells, grazing slopes, forests, mineral deposits, and neighboring settlements. People left the village at dawn and returned beneath the same tower at evening. Herds moving between seasonal pastures past monuments associated with different groups. Travelers approaching from the coast or interior encountered a sequence of towers that announced whose country they were entering, even when no guard stood on the terrace. The relationship with farmland was especially important. Grain fields demanded long-term investment. Land had to be cleared, prepared, planted, protected, harvested, and allowed to recover. The harvest then had to be processed and stored through the months when little grew. A community that built near productive soil was making a claim not only to present crops, but to future cycles of labour. The tower gave permanence to that claim. Its walls remained through failed harvests, family deaths, and changes of leadership, suggesting that the relationship between people and land was expected to continue. Storage inside or near the Nuraghi may have strengthened this role. Grain collected from several households could be protected in central spaces, then redistributed during shortages, ceremonies, or communal work. Whoever managed those stores gained influence, but the stores themselves may have been understood as belonging to the settlement, The tower represented the place where agricultural wealth was gathered and made secure. Its monumentality turned the practical act of keeping food into an expression of collective stability. Pastoral movement created a more flexible geography. Sheep, goats, and cattle required access to water and grazing that changed with the seasons. During wet months, lowlands might provide abundant pasture. In dry periods, herds could move toward uplands, shaded valleys, or more reliable springs. Nuraghi positioned along these routes may have helped coordinate passage and access. They could mark resting points, watering places, meeting grounds, or areas where different herding groups negotiated their rights. Such negotiation was likely constant. Too many animals on one pasture could destroy it. A blocked route could isolate herds from water. Theft or disputed ownership could lead to violence. Towers made surveillance possible, but they also provided places where disagreements might be settled before conflict became destructive. A community gathered beneath its monument possessed a visible symbol of unity during negotiation. The size and complexity of that monument may have affected how seriously its representatives were treated. Water sources carried even greater importance because they could not always be replaced. Springs, wells, and seasonal streams drew people and animals repeatedly to the same points. A tower near water might protect access, but it could also regulate sharing. During abundance, several groups could use the source. During drought, customary priorities became critical. Ritual may have helped manage these tensions by presenting water as sacred rather than privately owned. Rules attached to ancestral or divine authority were harder to challenge than rules imposed by one living individual. Routes between inland resources and coastal exchange zones also passed through Nuragic territories. Sardinia's metals, livestock products, agricultural goods, and crafted objects moved along paths connecting mines, settlements, anchorages, and gathering places. Imported materials travelled in the opposite direction. Towers overlooking valleys and passes could monitor this circulation. They may have supported toll-taking, protection, hospitality, or the storage of goods in transit. Yet the evidence remains incomplete, and it is unlikely that every route was controlled through a formal system. The coastline presented its own geography. Nuragic communities did not build exclusively on the sea, but coastal towers and settlements participated in movement across the Mediterranean. Sailors approaching Sardinia saw headlands, mountains, and perhaps prominent monuments marking inhabited zones. Coastal groups could guide visitors inland or control access to markets and resources. A tower visible from an anchorage might function as both warning and invitation this land was occupied, organized and ready to exchange on its own terms. Intervisibility between towers created relationships that extended beyond economic control. When one community could see another's monument, the neighboring group became part of its daily horizon. Fires or smoke might transmit warnings, though direct evidence for a standardized signal network is limited. More often, visibility itself may have mattered. A distant tower represented relatives, rivals, trading partners, marriage connections, or former enemies. Its presence reminded people that their own settlement belonged to a wider web. Those relationships could be hierarchical. A great multi-towered complex might dominate several smaller Nuraghi in the surrounding countryside. The smaller sites could belong to dependent households, allied hamlets, or specialized groups managing pasture and crops. Goods and people may have flowed toward the central settlement during feasts, ceremonies, emergencies, or political meetings. From the major tower, leaders could reinforce alliances and redistribute resources. Yet smaller communities retained their own monuments, suggesting that local identity remained important even inside broader networks. Territorial identity was therefore layered. A person could belong to a household, a village, a cluster of neighbouring towers, and a wider regional tradition at the same time. The Nuraghi gave material form to one level of that belonging. Its construction required cooperation, and its survival allowed descendants to imagine continuity with those who had built it. Even communities separated by rivalry shared the same architectural language. They competed through towers that also revealed how much they had in common. The placement of giants' graves, sanctuaries, and meeting spaces deepened these connections. Paths between the village, the tomb, the well, and the fields formed a ritual as well as practical geography. Processions may have followed routes repeated over generations. Ancestors buried beyond the settlement remained tied to the land used by their descendants. Sacred water places drew gatherings from several communities, temporarily crossing territorial divisions. The island was not a patchwork of sealed units, but a landscape of overlapping obligations. What survives suggests that the towers helped people negotiate a difficult balance. They asserted possession without eliminating cooperation. They displayed strength while providing places for exchange. They separated communities and connected them through a common visual system. Their meaning changed depending on who approached a home to those returning, a warning to strangers, a landmark to travellers, a symbol of alliance to neighbours, and perhaps an ancestral presence to everyone who lived beneath its shadow. This network did not end at Sardinia's shores. The routes marked by towers eventually reached ports, ships, and distant coastlines. Through them came metals, pottery, ideas, and visitors from societies whose own monumental worlds looked very different. The stone towers had organized the island from within, but the Mediterranean was beginning to press more strongly against its edges. The sea around Sardinia never functioned as an empty barrier. It was a road, dangerous and seasonal, but open to anyone with the skill, confidence, and reason to cross it. By the later Bronze Age, that road carried increasing numbers of ships, traders, craftspeople, emissaries, migrants, and objects between Sardinia and the wider Mediterranean. The island's stone towers belonged to a local tradition, yet the communities living beneath them were not cut off from distant worlds. They were part of a maritime network stretching toward the Italian peninsula, Sicily, Iberia, Cyprus, the Aegean, North Africa, and the eastern Mediterranean. Travel by sea did not require enormous ships or formal empires. Short crossings could be made in stages, following coasts and islands where crews found water, shelter, and information. Sardinia's central position made it difficult to ignore. Its mountains provided visible landmarks for approaching sailors, while sheltered inlets offered temporary anchorages. Inland, the island contained copper, lead, silver-bearing ores, forests, livestock, agricultural products, and skilled metal workers. These resources gave outsiders reasons to visit and Sardinians reasons to travel. Imported pottery provides some of the clearest evidence for contact. Fragments of Mycenaean-style ceramics have been found at several Sardinian sites, particularly in contexts dating to the later 2nd millennium BCE. Some vessels arrived from the Aegean or regions influenced by Aegean production, while others may have been made locally in foreign styles. A painted cup or storage vessel was more than an attractive object. It carried associations with distant places, unfamiliar customs, and the people able to acquire such goods. Even a few imported fragments could signal participation in networks extending far beyond the nearest valley. The presence of foreign pottery does not mean Mycenaean colonies controlled Sardinia. Earlier interpretations sometimes imagine waves of eastern settlers founding Nuragic centres or directing local development. The evidence does not support such a simple picture. Sardinian architecture, settlement patterns, and social traditions remain strongly local. Overseas goods were absorbed into an established island society rather than replacing it. Visitors may have lived temporarily in coastal settlements, and small groups may have settled permanently, but the Nuraghi were not transplanted Aegean palaces. Metal connected these worlds more powerfully than pottery. Bronze required copper and tin, yet the two ores were rarely found together in convenient quantities. This created long-distance exchange systems linking mines, workshops, ports, and consumers. Sardinia possessed copper resources and became an important zone of production and circulation. Tin may have reached the island through several routes, possibly from Iberia, Western Europe, or farther east. Scholars still debate the exact sources because metal was repeatedly melted, mixed, and recycled, erasing parts of its journey. Oxide ingots are among the most striking objects tied to this trade. These large slabs of copper were shaped with projecting corners, giving them a form loosely resembling an animal hide. They are best known from eastern Mediterranean shipwrecks and sites connected to Cyprus, a major centre of copper production. Fragments and examples found in Sardinia demonstrate links with this broader exchange world. Yet their presence raises difficult questions. Were the ingots imported as raw material, traded through intermediaries, carried by Sardinian sailors, or brought by foreign merchants? No single answer fits every discovery. Sardinian metalworkers did not merely receive material, they transformed it. Workshops produced tools, weapons, ornaments, vessels, and figurines using methods that reveal both local continuity and external influence. Mold types and object forms circulated across regions, but island craftspeople adapted them to their own preferences. Foreign techniques could be learned without foreign control. A craftsman might copy the balance of an imported sword, alter the decoration, and produce a weapon that belonged fully to Nuragic society. Amber travelled even farther, originating largely in northern Europe. It moved south through complex chains of exchange before reaching Mediterranean communities. Pieces found in Sardinia connected the island indirectly with landscapes its inhabitants may never have seen. Glass, ivory, beads, decorated ceramics, and specialized metal objects carried similar stories. Each item passed through multiple hands, gathering value not only from its material, but from the distance it represented. Exchange was never purely commercial. Gifts created alliances. Rare objects marked marriages or political agreements. Metal could reward warriors, craftspeople, or loyal households. Imported vessels might appear during feasts where leaders displayed connections to distant partners. A foreign object placed in a tomb or sanctuary could communicate status to both the living and the sacred powers. Goods moved through social relationships, and those relationships helped determine who gained influence within Nuragic communities. Sardinian objects also travelled outward. Pottery, metalwork, and perhaps food products have been identified beyond the island, though tracing their movement is often difficult. Nuragic pottery appears at sites in the western Mediterranean and occasionally farther east. This suggests that Sardinians were not passive recipients waiting on their shores. Some likely sailed abroad, served as intermediaries, joined foreign crews, or established small communities in overseas ports. Maritime knowledge would have been essential to an island society surrounded by active routes. Contact changed how communities understood distance. A settlement in the interior could receive objects that had passed through coastal centres and across several seas. Stories arrived with them, accounts of palace societies, fortified towns, unfamiliar rituals, catastrophic wars, rich markets, and distant rulers. Most of these stories vanished because they were never written down in Sardinia. Yet imported forms and technologies reveal that information travelled alongside goods. Nuragic leaders knew, at least indirectly, that other systems of power existed. The contrast may have strengthened local identity. A Mycenaean palace organised labour through writing, bureaucracy, and centralised storage. Nuragic Sardinia built thousands of regional stone towers, without developing the same visible administrative machinery. Contact with foreign states did not lead automatically to imitation. Sardinian communities adopted selected objects and techniques while preserving a political landscape based on local centres. The towers remained powerful because they represented continuity in a world of expanding exchange. Ports and coastal settlements likely became increasingly important as contact intensified. Goods arriving by sea had to be received, stored, redistributed, and carried inland. Coastal leaders could gain influence by controlling access to foreign merchants, while inland groups controlled the ores, animals, grain, and labour that made trade possible. This created opportunities for cooperation and tension. A coastal settlement might depend on alliances with several tower communities, each seeking favourable access to imported goods. The wider Mediterranean was itself unstable. During the final centuries of the Bronze Age, palace systems in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean suffered destruction, abandonment, and political collapse. Long-distance trade networks changed, though they did not disappear. Sardinia was affected by these disruptions but not erased by them. Its decentralized structure may have provided resilience. When one overseas partner vanished, communities could turn toward others. Local production continued even as the routes carrying certain goods shifted. What survives in the record suggests an island deeply connected yet stubbornly distinct. The Nuragic world borrowed, exchanged, travelled, and adapted, but it did not dissolve into the civilization surrounding it. Its towers remained unmistakably Sardinian, even as copper, pottery, amber, and ideas passed beneath their shadow. For a time, these monuments stood at the centre of a thriving network. Then the network changed, construction slowed, and the age that had raised the towers began to give way to something new. The age of tower building did not end in a single night. No island-wide decree stopped construction, and no catastrophe swept every Nuragic settlement away at once. Instead, the change appears gradually in the archaeological record. New towers became less common. Existing complexes were repaired, altered, or reused rather than expanded indefinitely. Villages continued to grow around old monuments, while attention shifted toward meeting buildings, sanctuaries, workshops, and places where goods and people gathered. The Nuraghi remained powerful, but the society around them was learning to express power in different forms. This transformation unfolded during the unsettled centuries surrounding the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age. Across much of the Mediterranean, palace states collapsed, cities burned, trade routes fractured, and political systems that had seemed permanent disappeared. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece fell, Hittite power in Anatolia dissolved, coastal centres in the eastern Mediterranean suffered destruction and abandonment. The causes remained debated and probably included warfare, internal unrest, drought, migration, economic breakdown, and the failure of tightly connected systems. No single explanation fully accounts for the scale of the disruption. Sardinia did not experience this crisis in exactly the same way. There were no great palace archives to vanish, and no centralized monarchy to collapse. Its communities were more dispersed, its authority more local, and its economy rooted in many villages rather than one administrative centre. This may have made the island more resilient. A failed alliance or interrupted sea route could damage a region without destroying the entire social order. Yet Sardinia was connected to the Mediterranean, and changes beyond its shores inevitably altered the movement of metal, pottery, knowledge, and people. The towers themselves began to lose their role as the primary focus of new investment. This does not mean they were suddenly abandoned. Many remained occupied, repaired, or incorporated into expanding settlements. Some chambers became storage rooms or workshops. Others received new hearths, floors, walls, and ritual deposits. Entrances were modified, courtyards filled with later construction. A tower that had once dominated open ground could become partially enclosed by houses, lanes, and public buildings. Its physical position remained central even as its original function became less important. At several sites, communal architecture grew more prominent. Meeting huts with circular benches suggest gatherings in which decisions, ceremonies, and distributions took place. These buildings were less vertical than Nuraghi, but socially significant. Power may have been moving outward from restricted towers into spaces where larger groups could participate. Leaders still existed, but authority may have depended increasingly on assemblies, ritual sponsorship, control of exchange, and the ability to represent the community before neighbouring groups. Sanctuaries also became major centres of activity. Sacred wells, springs, temples, and ceremonial enclosures attracted visitors from beyond a single village. People brought pottery, bronze objects, weapons, figurines, and ornaments as offerings. Markets, feasts, negotiations, and political meetings may have accompanied religious gatherings. A sanctuary could unite communities that remained independent in everyday life. Instead of building another tower to display strength, a group might contribute valuable objects to a sacred centre where its generosity and status were visible to a wider audience. This shift changed the scale of social interaction. Nuraghi had anchored local territories, but sanctuaries could connect entire regions. Paths once used mainly for herding, trade, and visiting relatives also carried pilgrims and delegations. At certain times of year, normally quiet sites may have filled with animals, temporary shelters, cooking fires, metal goods, and strangers speaking different local dialects. Ritual provided a framework in which rivalry could be contained, alliances renewed, marriages arranged, and disputes negotiated. Metallurgy gained even greater importance. Bronze production continued, and Sardinian craftspeople created increasingly elaborate objects. Hoards containing axes, tools, weapons, ingot fragments, and scrap metal reveal systems of storage, recycling, and exchange. Broken objects were valuable because they could be melted down and remade. Metal was not used once and discarded like pottery. It circulated through generations, changing shape while preserving material value. Some hoards may have been hidden during danger, while others were traders' or smiths' supplies. Certain deposits may have been offerings never intended for recovery. The distinction is not always clear. A collection buried beside a settlement could represent emergency wealth, ritual sacrifice, or raw material waiting for a craftsman who never returned. The evidence remains incomplete, but the volume of metal shows that economic and symbolic wealth was becoming increasingly portable. Power no longer had to be expressed only through walls that could not move. Overseas relationships also changed as older Eastern Mediterranean networks weakened. New patterns emerged in the Central and Western Seas. Contacts with the Italian peninsula, Sicily, Iberia, and eventually Phoenician merchants became increasingly important. These newcomers did not arrive in an empty landscape. They encountered well-established Sardinian communities controlling land, resources, and routes. Early interaction likely involved exchange, seasonal presence, negotiation, and gradual settlement rather than immediate conquest. The arrival of Phoenician traders and settlers during the early 1st millennium BCE eventually transformed parts of coastal Sardinia. New towns developed, writing appeared, and imported styles became more common. Yet the relationship between Phoenician and Nuragic groups varied widely. They traded, intermarried, cooperated, competed, and sometimes fought. Coastal communities could adopt foreign goods while maintaining local customs. Inland groups continued using towers and sanctuaries long after new urban settlements appeared by the sea. This was not the replacement of one people by another. Nuragic society changed from within while responding to new opportunities and pressures. Some local leaders may have gained wealth by controlling access to foreign trade. Others lost influence as roots shifted away from their settlements. Sanctuaries accumulated offerings and prestige. Craftspeople produced objects for wider networks. Villages reorganized around older monuments whose original builders had become ancestors. One surprising feature of this period is that the tower form remained culturally powerful, even as tower construction declined. Miniature Nuraghi appeared in ceremonial contexts, suggesting that the monument was becoming an image of identity, precisely when communities were no longer building many full-sized examples. The tower was passing from architecture into memory. It represented an inherited order, perhaps idealized as more unified, heroic, or ancestral than the changing present. The end of the Great Construction phase, therefore, was not the end of Nuragic civilization. It was a redirection of energy. Stone towers gave way to sanctuaries, assemblies, metallurgy, long-distance exchange, and new forms of public display. The old monuments remained in the centre of villages, but their meaning expanded as their practical roles diminished. They were becoming symbols of a past that later Sardinians would recreate in bronze, carve in stone, and place beside images of warriors whose silent faces still guard the mystery of the island. As full-sized tower construction slowed, the image of the Nuraghi became more powerful than ever. Sardinians began reproducing the form in miniature, carving small stone models or casting bronze versions that could be placed in meeting huts, sanctuaries, and ceremonial spaces. These objects were not architectural plans in the modern sense, though they preserved details that have vanished from many ruins. They were symbols. By shrinking the tower into an object that could be carried, displayed, or set at the centre of a gathering, communities transformed a building into an idea. Some models show a central tower surrounded by smaller ones, complete with upper platforms, projecting balconies, and structures no longer visible on most surviving Nuraghi. They suggest that the monuments once rose with greater complexity than their ruined walls reveal today. Wooden railings, roof structures, banners, or other perishable elements may have completed the skyline, though reconstructions remain uncertain. The models preserve not only physical details, but also the way later communities chose to remember the towers complete, elevated, and visually commanding. Placed inside a meeting hut, a model Nuraghi may have represented the settlement itself. Participants seated around the walls could face a miniature version of the monument that embodied their collective identity. Decisions about land, herds, alliances, conflict, and ritual were made in the presence of an image of the community's permanence. A leader could speak for the people, but the tower represented something larger than any individual. It stood for ancestors, territory, shared labour, and the claim that the group would continue after those present had died. The same symbolism appears in bronze figurines known as bronzetti. These small cast figures depict warriors, archers, chiefs, worshippers, musicians, animals, boats, and people engaged in everyday or ceremonial roles. Their details are often remarkable. Warriors carry shields, swords, bows, or spears. Some wear elaborate helmets with horns or crests. Others hold staffs, offer objects, or raise a hand in a gesture that may indicate greeting, prayer, authority, or submission. The figures are stylized rather than realistic, but their equipment and posture communicate rank, identity, and purpose. They were often deposited in sanctuaries, especially near sacred wells and gathering places. A bronze figurine could represent the person offering it, an ancestor, a deity, a warrior ideal, or a social role valued by the community. The exact meaning varied, and the evidence remains incomplete. Yet the act of dedicating metal was significant. Bronze required valuable raw material and skilled labour. Turning it into an image and placing it beyond ordinary use converted wealth into memory and sacred obligation. The warriors have attracted particular attention because they seem to confirm the martial character of Nuragic society. Their large shields, long weapons, and proud stance present an unmistakable image of armed status. Some wear equipment that appears ceremonial or exaggerated, suggesting that they represent ideals rather than ordinary soldiers. Warfare was real, but these figures may show how warriors wish to be seen disciplined, protected, connected to ancestors, and worthy of divine favour. Their appearance has also encouraged comparisons with the so-called Sea Peoples, groups named in Egyptian inscriptions during the upheavals at the end of the Bronze Age. One of those names, the Shurden, has often been linked to Sardinia because of similarities between the words, and because Egyptian images show warriors with horned helmets and round shields. The connection is possible, and some Sardinians may indeed have travelled or served as mercenaries in the eastern Mediterranean. However, the identification remains debated. Similar equipment can appear in different regions, and a resemblance in names does not prove that all Shurden came from Sardinia or that Nuragic society was created by returning warriors. The temptation to use the figurines as portraits of a single warrior nation oversimplifies their range. Alongside armed men appear women, priests or ritual specialists, shepherds, musicians, boxers, craftspeople, and people carrying offerings. Animals include cattle, deer, dogs, birds, and creatures rendered with symbolic exaggeration. Boats reveal the importance of maritime movement. These figures present Nuragic society as it wished to display itself before sacred powers productive, armed, mobile, hierarchical, and connected to the natural world. Then there are the stone giants of Monte Prama, among the most extraordinary survivals from early Iron Age Sardinia. Discovered in fragments in western Sardinia, these large statues represent archers, warriors, and figures often described as boxers because of the protective shields held above or beside their heads. Their faces are reduced to powerful geometric forms, with circular eyes and rigid features. Reassembled, they stand much larger than life. Unlike the small bronze offerings from which some of their forms may have drawn inspiration, the statues were associated with a burial area, though the exact arrangement and chronology remain debated. They may have marked the graves of important individuals or celebrated ancestral lineages claiming heroic status. Their scale turns the warrior image into landscape. A bronze figurine fits in the hand. A stone giant confronts the viewer at human height and beyond. The people represented were not merely remembered, they were magnified into guardians of ancestry and territory. Near the statues were models of Nuraghi, linking heroic figures directly with the tower tradition. This combination is revealing. The tower symbolized the community, while the warrior or ancestor embodied those who defended, founded, or represented it. Together they created a public statement about identity in a period of change. New coastal settlements, foreign traders, shifting alliances, and emerging forms of wealth were transforming Sardinia. Monumental art answered that uncertainty by looking backward toward the age of towers. This memory was selective. The original Nuraghi had been crowded with storage, cooking, work, negotiation, and repair. In symbolic form, those ordinary activities disappear. What remains is strength, height, order, and ancestry. Later communities remembered the towers less as smoky interiors and more as ideal monuments from a foundational past. This is a familiar process in human societies. Difficult, complicated history becomes compressed into a powerful image that tells people who they are. The models may also have helped unite communities whose political structures were changing. A sanctuary visited by several settlements could contain tower images representing different groups or a shared Nuragic identity. People who competed over land and trade still recognized the same architectural symbol. The Nuraghi had once divided the landscape into local centers, but in memory it could connect those centers into a broader cultural world. Foreign contact may have strengthened this need. When people encounter outsiders with different languages, writing systems, religious forms, and urban traditions, they often define their own identity more consciously. The miniature towers, bronze figures, and stone giants may reflect such a moment. They do not reject the wider Mediterranean, since many objects show external influence and participation in trade. Instead, they proclaim that Sardinia possessed its own ancestors, monuments, warriors, and sacred order. Scholars still debate whether the statues and figurines represent actual social ranks, mythic heroes, deities, or idealized ancestors. No single explanation fully accounts for their variety, yet all of them reveal a society deeply engaged with representation. Nuragic people were not only building and using monuments, they were creating images of themselves and selecting which parts of their past deserved to survive. By the time the stone giants stood beside graves and miniature towers appeared in sanctuaries, the Nuraghi had become more than architecture. It was memory given shape. The old question of whether the towers were forts, homes, or temples now became harder, because later Sardinians treated them as all these things at once places of strength, centres of community, and symbols of an ancestral world whose authority continued long after the builders were gone. By the time archaeologists had mapped thousands of Nuraghi, excavated villages, examined storage rooms, studied sacred wells, and compared miniature tower models, the old question had become impossible to answer with a single word. Fortress, residence, temple, storehouse, meeting place, watchtower, territorial marker, ancestral monument. Each interpretation explains part of the evidence, and each fails when forced onto every site. The problem was not that the towers lacked purpose. It was that modern categories were too narrow for buildings that gathered several kinds of power beneath the same stone roof. The fortress explanation remains the easiest to see. Thick walls resist attack, narrow entrances restrict movement, upper terraces offer observation. Internal wells and protected chambers could sustain people during danger. Major complexes with bastions and multiple towers seem designed to intimidate as well as defend. In a world where livestock could be stolen, crops destroyed, and rival communities drawn into violence, protection mattered. Some Nuraghi almost certainly served as strongholds, refugees, and centres from which armed groups controlled vulnerable routes or productive land. Yet defence alone does not explain the towers built in weak tactical positions, the dense clusters occupying the same small area, or the evidence of cooking, weaving, grinding, storage, and long-term domestic use. A fortress may contain daily activity, but when domestic remains dominate the record, warfare cannot remain the only organising idea. Many Nuraghi appear to have spent more time supporting ordinary life than resisting enemies. Their defensive strength may have been one advantage among several, valuable, precisely because food, tools, people, and status were already concentrated there. The residence theory addresses some of this evidence. A leading household could inhabit the tower, keeping valuables and provisions within protected chambers, while ordinary families lived in surrounding huts. The architecture would separate the powerful from the wider village without placing them far away. Its height and mass advertised rank. Visitors approaching the settlement would encounter the residents of authority before entering the domestic spaces beyond. But these towers are not comfortable palaces. Their interiors are dark, confined, and often poorly suited to large elite households. They contain no clear suites of luxurious rooms, grand audience halls, or decorated royal chambers comparable to palace societies elsewhere. Organic furnishings may have vanished, and later alterations may have erased traces of display, but the surviving architecture emphasizes mass and enclosure rather than comfort. If elites lived there, they did so inside buildings designed as much for symbolic and practical strength as for domestic ease. The storehouse interpretation provides another piece. Thick walls protect grain, tools, weapons, textiles, and metal. Centralized supplies could support the community during drought, poor harvest, conflict, or ceremonial gatherings. Control over those supplies would create authority. The tower may have functioned as a place where collective wealth was gathered, guarded, and redistributed. This would explain why domestic, political, and defensive activity overlapped. Still, storage does not account for the full architectural ambition. A simpler building could protect grain. Nuragic communities chose instead to raise monumental towers visible across entire valleys. Storage may explain what was kept inside, but not why the container had to dominate the horizon. The structure communicated something beyond practical need. It told neighboring groups that the community could gather labor, manage resources, and make its presence permanent. The watchtower theory fits sites with wide views and links between visible monuments. Signals might warn of approaching raiders, fire, or movements along routes. Observation from upper terraces could help manage herds, fields, and travel. But many Nuraghi are poorly positioned for long-distance surveillance, and the surviving distribution does not form one consistent communication network. Some towers can see several neighbors, others cannot. Watching was useful, but not universally decisive. The temple interpretation emerges from ritual deposits, later offerings, sacred reuse, miniature tower models, and the powerful atmosphere of the interior chambers. Some Nuraghi may have hosted ceremonies from an early stage. Others became sacred only after their original functions faded. Their association with ancestors, communal identity, and inherited authority would make ritual use almost inevitable. Yet they differ from purpose-built well temples and sanctuaries, where architecture directs attention toward water, offerings, and controlled ceremonial movement. Calling every Nurag a temple simply replaces one oversimplification with another. Perhaps the most useful interpretation sees them as social centers. In this view, the tower was a place where many essential functions converged because Nuragic life did not separate them as modern societies do. A leading household could live there while guarding communal stores. Elders could meet there before a feast. Warriors could retreat there during attack. Sacred objects could be kept in its niches. Ancestors could be remembered in its shadow. Goods could be distributed. Visitors received, and obligations confirmed beneath the authority of stone. This model also explains change through time. A tower might begin as the residence and stronghold of a powerful lineage. As a village grew around it, the building could become a communal store and meeting place. Centuries later, after upper levels collapsed and political structures changed, the old chamber could receive offerings as a sacred ruin. Archaeology often uncovers all these phases together, compressed into the same monument. The apparent contradiction between home, fortress, and shrine may simply reflect different moments in a long life. Regional variation must also be respected. Sardinia was never one uniform Nuragic state. Communities used different stone, occupied different environments, participated in different exchange routes, and faced different political pressures. A coastal tower connected to maritime trade might function differently from one guarding upland pasture. A large complex at the centre of a dense village carried different responsibilities from a small isolated monument near seasonal grazing. The shared architecture did not require identical use. Scale mattered as well. Simple towers may have served individual communities or extended households. Multi-towered complexes could dominate wider territories and support larger gatherings, richer stores, and stronger defensive forces. Some sites developed into regional centres whose influence extended across networks of smaller Nuraghi. Yet even these great monuments show repeated alteration, suggesting that their meaning was negotiated rather than fixed by an original plan. The evidence remains incomplete because only a fraction of surviving towers have been excavated thoroughly, and many early investigations removed objects without recording their exact context. Agricultural work, stone robbing, road construction, and later occupation destroyed countless surrounding features. Organic materials vanished. Written explanations never existed or have not survived. Archaeologists are reconstructing a complex institution from its stone shell and scattered debris. What emerges is less satisfying than a single dramatic answer, but far more revealing. The Nuraghi were not secretly one thing misunderstood for centuries. They were powerful because they could be many things at once. Their architecture concentrated protection, wealth, memory, authority, labour, and sacred meaning in a form every community recognized. That adaptability allowed them to remain useful through generations of change. The real surprise was not that archaeologists had mistaken temples for forts or houses for watchtowers. It was that the towers refused the categories imposed on them. They belonged to a social world in which leadership, storage, defense, ritual, residence, and identity overlapped. To understand what the Nuragic people were truly building, the final step is to look beyond the rooms and walls toward the relationships those monuments created among the living, the dead, and the landscape itself. What the Nuragic communities built was larger than the sum of walls, chambers, stairways, and terraces. Each tower was a structure of stone, but the system of towers across Sardinia was a structure of relationships. It joined households to villages, villages to land, living communities to their ancestors, and local territories to a wider island world. The Nuraghi endured because they answered several needs at once. Yet their deepest importance may have rested in the way they made society visible to itself. A community is always partly imagined. Its members cannot remain together every moment, and they do not always agree. Families compete over pasture, leaders struggle for influence, harvests fail, marriages draw people between settlements, and old alliances weaken. The tower offered a fixed point amid these uncertainties. It told those who lived nearby that their lives belonged to something older and more durable than any single household. They might argue beneath it, store grain inside it, defend it, repair it, or gather around it during ceremonies, but the monument continued to represent them even when they were divided. Building the tower created some of those bonds. Moving heavy blocks required cooperation across families and seasons. Skilled masons depended on herders, farmers, toolmakers, cooks, and those who organized supplies. The completed structure preserved the memory of that labor even after the names of the workers disappeared. Every course of masonry was evidence that a group had once acted together. Rival communities could construct larger monuments. But competition itself strengthened the shared belief that towers mattered. This may explain why the Nuraghi spread so widely without being imposed through a single central authority. Communities copied an architectural tradition because it expressed a recognizable form of belonging. The towers differed in size and complexity, but they spoke the same visual language. A traveller crossing Sardinia entered valleys with unfamiliar local customs, yet encountered monuments whose form remained intelligible. The tower declared that this place was organized, inhabited, and connected to the wider Nuragic world. Their adaptability was crucial. A building designed for only one purpose becomes useless when that purpose disappears. The Nuraghi could change. During conflict, it offered refuge and observation. During peace, it held supplies, people, tools, and meetings. As settlements expanded, it became a centre surrounded by houses. As political systems shifted, it remained an inherited symbol. When its upper floors collapsed, the lower chamber could still serve as storage, shelter, workshop, shrine, or burial place. Each generation found a reason not to abandon it completely. That flexibility created resilience. Nuragic society never depended on one palace, one ruler, or one administrative capital. Power was distributed across many centres. This fragmentation could produce rivalry and violence, but it also meant that the failure of one settlement did not bring down the entire island. Communities adapted independently to changing climate, interrupted trade, population movement, and foreign contact. The towers anchored local survival while preserving a shared cultural identity. They also shaped memory. Human recollection rarely survives accurately for many centuries, yet monuments allow stories to gather around visible remains. A child born long after a tower's construction could still enter the chamber, climb its stairway, and touch stones placed by ancestors. The building made the past physically present. Even when the original meaning was forgotten, the structure demanded explanation. New stories replaced old ones, but the tower never became meaningless. Later inhabitants of Sardinia continued this process. Phoenician and Punic settlements developed along the coasts. Carthaginian power expanded. Rome conquered the island after the First Punic War. Medieval communities, shepherds, farmers, and travellers passed among the ruins. Stones were removed for walls and houses, chambers became shelters, and towers acquired legends of giants, spirits, hidden treasure, and vanished peoples. Each age interpreted the Nuraghi through its own fears and expectations. Modern archaeology added another layer. Early investigators saw fortresses because fortresses were familiar. Later scholars recognized villages, domestic work, ritual use, regional networks, and long sequences of transformation. New methods continue to reveal details through excavation, landscape survey, radiocarbon dating, residue analysis, metal studies, and digital reconstruction. Yet greater knowledge has not produced one final definition. It has instead shown why a final definition may be impossible. This is not a failure of archaeology. It is a correction of the assumption that every ancient monument must possess a single permanent purpose. Buildings live within society. They change as the people around them change. A church becomes a warehouse, a palace becomes a museum, and a defensive wall becomes a civic symbol. The same flexibility existed in prehistory, even if the written documents that would explain it are missing. The Nuraghi surprise archaeologists because they preserve centuries of overlapping use inside structures whose form appears deceptively simple. What survives in the record suggests that the towers helped communities manage both separation and connection. They marked local territories but repeated an island-wide tradition. They protected stored wealth while making communal strength visible. They elevated leaders without erasing collective identity. They linked everyday work with ceremony, defense with residence, and political authority with ancestral memory. They did not eliminate conflict or inequality, but they gave society places in which those forces could be organized. The towers may therefore be understood as machines of continuity, not machines in the mechanical sense, but social devices that converted labor into permanence, resources into authority, and landscape into memory. Stone was their material, yet time was their true medium. A tower gained significance because it endured while generations passed around it. Its age became part of its power. This is why later Sardinians made miniature Nuraghi after the great building age had slowed. They were not simply reproducing old architecture, they were carrying continuity into a changing world. The model tower placed in a sanctuary or assembly hall declared that the community still belonged to the order represented by the ancient monuments. The full-size structures had organized territory. Their images now organized memory. No tower can speak directly for its builders. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars will continue debating differences between sites, periods, and regions. Some Nuraghi were more defensive than others. Some housed influential families. Some guarded stores or routes. Some became sacred. Many changed function repeatedly. The search for a universal answer should give way to a more revealing conclusion. The Nuragic people created an architectural form strong enough to contain many meanings without losing its identity. The stone towers were not merely what archaeologists first expected, but neither were those early interpretations entirely mistaken. They were forts, though not only forts, they were homes, though rarely ordinary ones. They were stores, meeting places, territorial statements, and monuments to ancestors. Their true achievement was the combination. Nuragic communities built places where the practical and symbolic could reinforce one another, where the needs of the present were placed inside the authority of the past. Today, thousands still stand, reduced by collapse, weather, reuse, and silence. Their upper terraces are gone. Their wooden fittings have vanished. The voices once carried through their chambers cannot be recovered, yet the towers continue performing one of their oldest functions. They hold Sardinia's landscape together, linking fields, villages, mountains, and generations through a shared and unmistakable presence. Evening settles slowly over the island. The stone loses its warmth, and the dark entrances become difficult to distinguish from the gathering shadows. Roads pass monuments whose builders never imagined asphalt. Engines, electric lights, or aircraft crossing the sky above them. Sheep move through fields divided by walls made from reused ancient blocks. Villages glow in the distance, while the towers remain where they have stood through more seasons than anyone can count. There is something humbling in their endurance. Civilizations often imagine that their most important achievements are the events recorded in names, victories, laws, and dynasties. Nuragic Sardinia left almost none of these in readable form. Its rulers, if rulers they were, are anonymous. Its languages are silent. Its ceremonies survive only as arrangements of stone and discarded objects. Yet the civilization has not vanished completely, because it placed part of itself into the land. The towers remind us that memory does not always require writing. It can survive in a path worn toward a doorway, in a chamber blackened by ancient fire, in a staircase curling upward through a wall, or in the distant outline of a ruin seen from another hill. Meaning changes, but presence remains. Perhaps that is the final lesson of the Nuraghi. Their mystery is not a locked answer waiting to be discovered beneath one last stone. It is the distance between the lives once lived there and the fragments that time has allowed to survive. Archaeology narrows that distance patiently and imperfectly, but it cannot erase it. As darkness spreads across Sardinia, the towers return to silhouette. They no longer command warriors, shelter grain, or gather councils beneath their vaults. Still, they watch over the same ridges and valleys. The people who raised them are gone, but the shape of their belonging remains thousands of stone forms holding their place against the night.